Dr. Miller received both his Master's of Divinity and Doctor of Ministry degrees from the Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Since 1966, he has been pastor of the West Side Baptist Church in Omaha. Dr. Miller is a widely sought-after speaker, as well as the author of over 20 books. In fact, we have 13 in our collection if you want to look at them later on tonight. Then we also have them in our circulating collection downstairs. We hope to add our remaining copies later on. Dr. Miller has published books of poetry, fantasy, popular theology, humor, and inspirational works. His first book, The Singer, has sold over 400,000 copies. Dr. Miller?
Thank you, Jim. Well, I'm glad to get to be here and glad to see that you're here. And what I'm going to do is try to read from several books, shorter selections. Some of them my wife will read with me, and some she will not. I will try to comment a little bit on each book and also try to keep the whole situation very, very short. I think one of my favorite books, if not my favorite one that I have ever written, is this book called If This Be Love. If This Be Love, I wrote about, I don't know, 3 years ago or so. I took a collection of 17 of my poems to my wife and wrote a book of 17 chapters describing the situation out of which each of the poems came. Did that for two reasons. Poetry is dreadfully hard to get published. And so I figured that if I had a kind of narrative thing accompanying it, maybe I would get the poems in print. That indeed what happened. I think the thing I like about this book is that I published it. My wife has typed all the manuscripts I've ever done, except this one. And I've worked on this on airplanes and in distant cities and in quiet places, had the correspondence changed to my office so that my wife wouldn't intercept it, and sort of wrote this book as a surprise for our 25th wedding anniversary, which was 3 years ago. And it came out on our 25th wedding anniversary, and I was able to take her to the bookstore and surprise her by presenting her with this book. So it has a special meaning to me. The very first chapter of this book is one which describes my mother. They always say that every boy marries his mother, and I think to some degree that's true. We look for the qualities that meant so much to us as we grew up, and those are the same qualities we seek in our lifelong friend and lover and companion. So this first little chapter and the accompanying sonnet describes my mother. She came before you in prominence, but in time, and yet in every way she readied me for you. To know at first a woman whose very image would be stamped upon your being seems a monster strike against your uniqueness. Yet here I begin. I knew her first, not just before I knew you, but before I knew anybody. First knowledge emerges unsteady in a haze. It is umbilical, inseparate, some husky alto lullaby. I remember, and yet do not. Life dim and far emerges from the womb. It was separate life, yet never quite separate. An early reverie of gray amnesia, a there-ness, not yet there. Remembering is not an issue. Becoming comes from the shadow and moves toward light only gradually. Without a sense of self, my knowledge of myself did not emerge as one life, but as two. Life was not mine, but ours. The two of us were there at once, as far back as I can probe the fringes of my memory. She was there some 20 years before you. She was there when my father left, when the bombs shattered the balmy air above faraway Hawaii. And with her covey of little ones and no means of support except her two good hands, her strong intention was to serve her family. She vowed that her life would give life to her brood of 9. It's a tremulous contagion, contracted fear, spread by those who volunteer to quake. If she was afraid, I never knew it. In her confident presence, I never knew there were reasons to fear, and thus I grew up braver than I might have been. I never knew I was poor either. From time to time, there are those who do spin straw to gold, and those from whose thinnest poverty they create a sense of strong abundance. The house my father left to us was unfinished. However, not knowing what a finished house looked like, I was never aware of the uncompleted state of ours. I could tell it was small, 3 rooms, and no indoor plumbing. We burned wood when the Oklahoma winter was short, and coal when it was not. My mother was a pragmatist. Wood ranges were supposed to yield hot berry pies and overflow with yeasty loaves of bread. For countless winters, I stood before that iron icon in the kitchen and learned that abundance is never what we have, but what we suppose we have. I was as rich as my mother was rich. I never knew the poverty of those days. At Christmas, she would read by light of a kerosene lamp, which we called a coal oil lamp, and she would read the Dickens Christmas stories. With never so much as a goose of our own for Christmas dinner, we all felt sorry for the Cratchits. In the midst of that otherwise desperate situation, my mother's inner wealth was a spirit so abundant, it fostered a luxurious deception. We were all rich. Our little house backed up to the tracks. The locomotives ran down only an alley or so away from our rough-weathered dwelling. The tracks were the parallel footprints of mammoth dragons that stalked the land in which I lived. They came by day and night, the trains that left me dreaming by the tracksides. I much romanticized those great locomotives. Enraptured, I waved at engineers who rode the iron dragons like powerful warlords on armored beasts. I think she knew how my reverie constructed dragons from these puffer bellies that drew strings of namby-pamby cars along the silver rails. Some said the tracks went all the way to St. Louis and ended in Los Angeles, passing Oklahoma. But Disneyland was decades away, and thus the rails held a mysterious enchantment to me. The tracks were real, so real that the steel dragons that went down them would flatten my pennies to the size of dollars. The same iron wheels sent earthquakes up and down the line, and the grumbling steam would rattle every window in our house. But the tracks were not dreaming places for her. While I celebrated their intrigue, she celebrated their gravel beds, where cross ties splintered by the spikes held more than rails. The old wooden railway cars jolted and banged around during harvest, and they would leak. Their spillage was grain, a kind of manna, a daily bread, a windfall to our poor economy. She would take a pail and broom and go to the tracks to sweep the spilled grain, and I would accompany her. The grain we found not only fed our meager flock of chickens, but was a staple in our diet as well. The cars were full of wheat, and so indeed were the rusty barrels behind our house, where we stored the grain we retrieved from those leaky cars. At harvest time, we worked long, gathering the immense piles of trackside grain, and I despised the practical drive that was rooted in her thrift. Yet her mundane view of the tracks held life for her little ones. And she knew harvest would come and there would be wheat between those rails. We are the gleaners, she said, as we crossed the fields on the way home from the far tracks. There was a second spur about a mile from our home, and we gleaned the distant rails as well as those at hand. The distant rails were most fruitful because the old cars sat longer on those rails. Their spillage was more abundant there. Thus we crossed the wider fields, carrying heavy sacks or pails to gather all the grain we could. I hated these trips. There was too little romance in the strain of lifting chubby burlap sacks. I despised the burdens. It pressed all my imagination to drudgery, and steel dragons dwindled to ugly trains, and life grew harsh there. And I learned to trade my enchantment for such simple things as bread. And yet the fond distinction between a child and a man I learned by walking across those wide fields and crossing the tracks. I cannot now, as St. Paul suggests, put away these childish things since I have become a man. 1,000 times no, for in such childish things is wisdom rooted. I think I learned a love of walking across those distant fields, and I know that in the crossing of those fields, my manhood was defined. The poem which accompanies it reads, 3 decades past, I skipped along beside her. Soul tired, I carried grain and grumbled. How tall she looked, how large the fields. Her stride was smooth. Attempting to keep pace, I stumbled. She sat the grain where all the grass seemed dead, and ran her fingers through my tangled thatch. Someday, the fields will seem so small, she said. When you've grown large, the fields will be no match. Fields are very big, I said. You'll see, she grinned and kissed my immaturity. Our shadows were El Greco-esque as we trudged on across the endless earthen sea. She sleeps beneath those fields where she stood tall, and I at last can see the fields are small. So that is one of my more recent books, but probably one of my favorite books. The one that certainly has sold the most, as James has already said, has been The Singer, a book that surprised both me and the publisher by doing as well as it has done. As a matter of fact, when the publisher agreed to take the book, he said that we're going to print 5,000 of them. He said in 10 years we will still have 4,000 of them on skids in our warehouse. actually turned out to be gloriously wrong. In the first month, it was out of print again, and it's gone through 27 printings since it first came out. The entire trilogy series is well over 1 million in sales and is now translated into 5 European languages. I've asked my wife to read a little selection with me on this one. This particular selection shows the singer, who is, of course, a Christ type in this allegory, as he meets Mary Magdalene, whom I call the friendship seller. A friend of mine, who first read this, said that's the kindest way I've ever heard that said. She did sell friendship. Of course, she, in the Bible, was a prostitute. And this is the kind of thing that happened when Jesus meets her, the singer, as he encounters this woman. We'll read this together. He met a woman in the street, and she leaned against a half-open door and sang through her half-parted lips a song that he could barely hear. He knew her friendship was for hire. She was without a doubt a study and desire. Her hair fell free around her shoulders, and intrigue played upon her lips.
"Are you betrothed?" she said.
"No, only loved," he answered.
"And do you pay for love?"
"No, but I owe it everything."
"You are alone. Could I sell you but an hour of friendship?"
Deaf to her surface proposition, he said, "Tell me of the song that you were singing as I came upon you. Where did you learn it?"
His question troubled her. At length she said, "The first night that I ever sold myself, I learned it from a tall, impressive man."
"And did he play a silver pipe?"
"Do you know the man who first bought me?"
"Yes, not long ago, in fact, he did his best to teach that same song to me."
"I cannot understand. I sell friendship, and you your melody. Why would he teach us both the self-same song?"
"He only has one song. He therefore teaches it to everyone. It's a song of hate."
"No, it is a song of love. The first night that he held me close, he sang it tenderly. And so in every way he owned me while he sang to me of love."
"And have you seen him since?"
"No, not him, but a never-ending queue of men with his desires."
"So it was no love song. Tell me, did he tell you that in the merchandising of your soul someday you'd find someone who'd take you home, not simply leave his fee upon the stand, but take you home to care for you and cherish you?"
"Those were indeed his very words. How can you know them?"
"And have you found the one he promised?"
"Not yet."
"And how long have you peddled friendship?"
"Some 20 years have gone since first I learned the song that you inquire about."
We sometimes give ourselves to hate in masquerade and only think it love. And all our lives we sing the song we thought was right. The Canyon of the Damned is filled with singers who thought they knew a love song. Listen, and I'll sing to you a song of love. He began the melody so vital to the dying men around him. In the beginning was a song of love.
She listened and knew for the first time she was hearing all of love that there was. Her eyes swam when he had finished. She sobbed and sobbed in shame. "Forgive me, Father Spirit, for I have sinned and am undone for singing weary years of all the wrong words."
The singer touched her shoulder and told her of the joy that lay ahead if she could learn the music he had sung.
He left her in the street and walked away, and as he left, he heard her singing his new song. And when he turned to wave the final time, he saw her shaking her head to a friendship buyer. She would not take his money.
And from his little distance, the singer heard her use his very words. "Are you betrothed?
No, only loved.
And do you pay for love?"
No, but I owe it everything."
Okay, three of the books that I have written have, of course, applied specifically to the church. And this particular book, the Philippine Fragment, is a kind of satirical look at the church of today as it might have been set back in the first century. I've always had a little hard time believing in these faith healers who seem to always get things healed. And I think that some miracles do happen, but I think generally there's a lot of charlatans out there, and trying to locate them gets hard. In this particular verse, or little reading, we're talking about Helen of Hierapolis, who was not the faith healer she would like to have been, but turns out to be more authentic than she might have been. And so we read together again. Shortly after my arrival in the city, I made another new friend, Helen of Hierapolis. She's a dynamic lover of people, and is so bound up in her love for Christ that she walks in an aura of esteem. I am not usually taken with traveling healers. You will remember my disappointment for Hiram the healer of Hellespont, who claimed instant help for all who would in faith touch his sequin toga. He lost so much of his following in Western Asia that he couldn't even get relief from a toothache. But Helen is different. She comes to Philippi with the conviction that God loves all suffering people and is determined to participate with God in his love. I met her near the synagogue, where she was talking to a group of blind beggars. I was surprised when she didn't try to heal them, but just brought each of them a cane and reminded them that the curbs on Caesar's Boulevard were especially high. She reminded them that they should be careful because it's very hard to hear a chariot coming down an unpaved road.
Someday,
She told them as we walked away,
light will be universal, and every eye will behold eternal love.
they didn't feel as though she cheated them. She's not much of a show woman, I'm afraid. She just mixes humanity and divinity to take it as far as it will go. And I am the richer to know her. Sister Helen opened a great crusade in Philippi on Thursday. She is a sensation of the leper colony. She rarely does anything anyone would call a miracle. Last week she laid hands on a little crippled boy and was not able to heal him, but she did give him a new pair of crutches and promised to take him for a walk in the park in Philippi. And yesterday with my own eyes I saw her pass an amputee selling styluses. She touched his legs and cried,
Grow back, grow back. In the name of Jesus of Nazareth, grow back.
Well, Clement, I wanted so to see the man's legs grow back, but they didn't. Poor Helen. What's a faith healer to do with an amputee that refuses to grow legs on command? She sat down on the pavement, crossed her legs on the cold pavement, and began selling styluses herself. Soon she was talking to him, and before long they were both laughing together. And for an hour they laughed, and by nightfall they were having a wonderful, uproarious good time. When it was time to go, Helen's legs were so stiff from disuse they refused to move. Her legless, stylus-selling friend cried in jest,
Grow strong, grow strong, grow strong.
Helen only smiled and staggered upward on her unsteady legs. And then she looked down at her lowly friend and said,
I offer you healing. You will see. It is only one world away. Someday,
She stopped and smiled.
you will enter a new life, and you will hear our Savior say to your legless stumps, Grow long, grow long. Then you will know that glory which Sister Helen only dreamed for you.
He smiled and said, Do you heal everyone this way?
It is better to heal with promises than to promise healing.
You're right, Sister Helen, but more than right, you're an evidence that our Father yet heals the spirit of amputees. And once the spirit is healed, the legs can be done without. Helen turned and walked on down the street, and she was near the amphitheater where she holds her great crusades when she saw a girl without any arms.
Grow long, grow long. In the glorious name of Jesus Christ, grow long.
The girl looked puzzled, and at her shoulders, where her arms refused to be, and they didn't seem to be growing,
I was afraid of that.
said Helen.
Oh, well, I can miss my meeting one night, I guess. Young lady, how long has it been since anyone combed your hair?
And she sat down beside her new friend and took out her comb, and for the first time in my whole life, I wanted to be a faith healer. That's, again, a book which looks at some of the faults and foibles of the church. And in the last couple of years, I've gotten into children's literature, and I have enjoyed it. I've been able to do at a number of universities now some kiddie lit sections, and have enjoyed it. This first little book I've taken, of course, the rhyme scheme that Lewis Carroll made popular 100 years ago, and tried to put it into some of the biblical emphasis. This particular one is on creation, and it's called Buckets of Nothing. It takes 3 minutes to read the whole book, and so I shall. Have you ever wondered why God made this earth with its beavers and babies and bunnies and birds? Now, before God made anything, nothing was here, nothing was far, and nothing was near. Nothing was ground, and nothing was air. There was plenty of nothing just everywhere. Wherever there's nothing, you'll always find black. In nothing, there always is plenty of that. I can't say how much, but there was no lack. Maybe 10 million sextillion buckets of black. But one day God said, this black makes me lonely. Who needs all this black? It's like walking around with my head in a sack. 10 million sextillion buckets of night is much too much nothing. So let there be light. Wow, the black all turned white. Maybe 10 million sextillion buckets of light. The second day came and God said, well, I'll be. Now that there's light, I'd like something to see. Who could be lonely with something to see? I'll start making something. Now what will it be? On days 3, 4, and 5, the world came alive with wonderful things like flowers on a hill. But God only sighed, I'm quite lonely still. Day 6 came at last, and God finished his task. He made all the warthogs and long-necked giraffes. When God saw how long their necks were, he laughed. I've made these giraffes just as I should. There are times when a 7-foot neck is quite good. They love to eat leaves from the top of the trees. They'll need those long necks and their long bony knees. They're gracefully tall, all spotted and specky. It's good that I've made them so leggy and necky. Even after giraffes, God was lonely, it's true, so he made 772 more marvelous things like chipmunks and shrews. And just before lunch, God looked at the crowd of things he had made and then said out loud, I think I will make a huge gray machine with a tail on each end and a hulk in between. This oversized beastie will not be a runt. He'll be 6,000 pounds of trumpet and grunt. I think I will call him a gray elephant. I'm lonely, God said. I wish elephants could do something more than just trumpet and grunt. They're big and they're nice, but they've nothing to say. And they just stand around eating peanuts all day. I'm still very lonely. I know what I'll do. I'll make me a man who is just 6'2", who can go for a walk and talk now and then, so that I will not ever be lonely again. And God did just that. In one wink of his eye, Adam was made and stood and said, my, it's so good to be here. Just look at that sky. God smiled. For millions of years, Adam, millions on end, I've been lonely, so lonely. Will you be my friend? Forever, laughed Adam, I need a friend too. And that is why God made both me and you. Will God ever quit being friends with us? Never. God's friendship is special. His friends are forever. I think that children's literature intrigues me because of its simplicity and the power that sometimes couches itself in that simplicity. I'm, of course, a pastor and have been for 30 years, and 22 of them have been in Omaha, where our church has grown and grown and grown. And I'm always amazed, so much of my writing, of course, it captures some of the faults and foibles of the evangelical church, which I think, by the way, has been a kind of scarcity. There aren't too many writers which are willing to look at the and write out loud about the things that's wrong with the church. It's comical little things, it's little hypocrisies and so forth. But mine have done that. I always wanted to go on a cruise, and about 2 years ago I got invited to teach the Bible on a gospel cruise. Actually, I was supposed to be teaching on this cruise on spiritual discipline. Now, I don't know if you've ever been on a cruise or not, but it's not the place where you think about any kind of discipline. And I found myself eating sweet rolls and all kinds of sweetmeats all day long and trying to talk about how to practice self-denial at night. It's a very frustrating week for me. That coupled with some people I've known who are part of a new kind of holistic movement in the church with which I'm often in disagreement, a movement which says that if you believe in Jesus, everything will come up a bed of roses. I don't think that's the case. I think it's great to believe in Jesus, but I don't think that everything will end up a bed of roses. And so I, after coming back from this cruise where I was so frustrated in talking about self-denial while I gained 10 pounds, I wrote this little thing. Fred and Irma are together, leaning over the rail. Fred is a kind of Archie Bunkerish sort of a Christian, and Irma a kind of submissive housefrau sort of wife. And they wind up on a Bible cruise together. And in this one, I will read the part of Fred. Of course, Barb will read Irma. How long have we had this cruise planned, Irma?
About 3 months, Fred.
I'm so seasick. I can't believe I've been waiting this long to feel this bad. Everything looks so green.
You're kind of cute when you're green, Fred.
Any more Dramamine?
It's back in the cabin, Fred. I'll go get you some. I hate to see you so nauseated and irritable.
Well, I am nauseated, but I'm not irritable. You remember what our textbook is for this cruise, don't you?
Zelsa Zippingers. No sickness, no hard times, just Jesus.
But this ship doesn't stop wobbling. I think I'm going to throw up.
The tide is high, Fred. Zelsa says that all sickness comes from faithlessness, and that if we really trust God, we'll never even have a headache again.
I know I'm going to throw up. You read too many wacko books, Erm. You ought to cut back on that kind of stuff, because there was a lady back in Boynton Falls that went crazy because of reading too many God books. She finally thought she was a faith healer, but she died before she could really get her ministry off the ground. It always seems kind of funny when a faith healer dies, and they all do sooner or later, Erm.
Zelsa Zippinger died last week, too.
No sickness, no hard times, just dead.
Fred, I'm sorry you're so seasick on this cruise. I just wanted you to enjoy the Bahamas and Brother Willis's lecture on the disciplined life and the mighty metal mindset.
He's 50 pounds heavier than I am. How can the man teach us about the disciplined life? I feel awful.
You do look a little green around the gills, Fred. But remember, our text for the cruise, no sickness, no hard times, just Jesus by Zelpha Zippinger.
Yeah, the late Zelpha Zippinger?
Well, yes, the late Zelpha Zippinger.
Who died of pneumonia after a whole mind, whole body, whole destiny conference?
Well, yes.
The same Zelpha Zippinger who wrote the song, "In Heaven There's No Sickness, and when heaven gets in you, you can't have a common cold or the Asiatic flu. In heaven there's no cancer, lumbago, or arthritis. No angel in the court of God ever had nephritis. No saint on Golden's glory streets ever had bursitis. So, brother, when we walk by faith, Satan cannot spite us. Just walk by faith, and you will have no sickness or no hard times, because Jesus will delight us." That Zelpha Zippinger?
Well, yes.
I think I'm going to throw up. Was Zelpha Zippinger disciplined?
I have no idea, Fred. I guess so.
I mean, was she overweight or real trim?
Her picture on the back of the book looks like she could have been a little overweight, dear. Why do you ask?
What are we doing on a disciplined life cruise, eating cream puffs and reading books by Zelpha Zippinger anyway? I tell you, Irma, I just don't trust a thick lecturer on Christian discipline. All right, and of course that book, sort of all the way through, takes what I hope are some honest looks at the church. There are only three other books that I want to read from. These are from two from another set of novels that I've done for teenagers, and I like this particular description of a snake who is kind of the heroine of this story. A snake is the guardian of the singreal, which is a huge diamond that everybody seems to be struggling to achieve in this novel. And Daldine is thousands of years old because she has guarded this great diamond for that length of time. And she has some kinds of arthritic problems as only snakes can have. And this particular night has been a cold one, and she slept on the hearth. And toward the morning, the hearth got cold, so she crawls upon her mistress' belly to wake her for a trip she has to take. So let me read for you here. Daldine, who is the serpent now, had coiled up before the hearth. She usually liked the cold room, but she was getting older, and this winter had been particularly harsh. There were no tilt winds in the highlands, and the surrounding trees of quarrystone woods almost completely shut out the straight winds. The trees did not prevent the cold, however, and Daldine felt its severity. In the evening, when the hearth was at a zenith blaze, she lay in the corner stretched out to avoid as much of the heat as she could. But as the fire died on a cold night, she slithered up closer and closer to the weakening flame, and on an early winter morning she could always be found coiled up right next to the unsure embers. She knew this was a special day, for her mistress, Belissa, would have to go out into the cold morning to run an errand for her father. So Daldine took it upon herself to wake her mistress to be sure she got an early start. She uncoiled herself, slipped noiselessly across the floor. The blue rock tiles of the floor felt like ice when they touched the scales of her underside, and she shivered. What am I to do, she thought. A serpent in winter lives only for the hope of spring. May it come soon. She said half aloud as she reached the bedpost, twisting herself around it, and she rose from the cold floor to the warm comforters of Melissa's bed. Coiled upon her mistress' stomach, she said, "Awake, Melissa." Daldine was old, and all her life she had tried to eliminate the S's from her speech. But they continued to persist and stick in every S-y word she said. She was always cold. "Now, it's so early. Must I get up now?" protested her mistress. "You must. Besides, if you think it's cold here, try sleeping on a rock floor before the hearth." Her family had built Daldine 2 beds to try to keep her off the floor in winter, but neither of the beds had proved satisfactory to the snake. One of the beds was only a few inches wide and several feet long, and it was not only strange looking, but uncomfortable to sleep in. Daldine had protested this curious piece of furniture, insisting that no serpent could sleep on so straight and stretched out. But the second bed was square, offering her room to coil in slumber, but she could not peacefully coil in a square bed. The miserable geometry of the whole thing kept her awake nights, so she went back to sleeping on the floor. Melissa shuddered at the thought of rising and pulling her comforter over to shut out Daldine, but Daldine was hard to ignore. Her scales were mirror-like, gold and scarlet, and in fact flashed like the facets of the diamond that she guarded. Her eyes were slits of light that could flash like opal beacons to any who ignored her. Upon her head she possessed 2 small horns that had been fitted with ornamental silver knobs. She was beautiful, but obstinate. In fact, Melissa's father was a star watcher, and he had inherited Daldine after the siege of the castle Muldoon. She had slept for 3,000 years at the base of the pedestal before the throne room, and she was millennia younger then, and therefore more alert in those days. She once had been assigned the eternal task of guarding the great diamond Singrio, which was the treasure of Muldoon, but the marauders attempted to seize it as their own. Their effort to steal the stone had failed, and now the Singrio had survived as the last of the ancient treasury. It had come through time and circumstances to belong to the Star Watcher, who delighted to own the large diamond. But sometimes the Star Watcher would trip over Daldine in the dark, and he would complain about the foul luck that was his to inherit a snake as well. At such moment, Daldine always reminded him, for it was not like her to be silent, that them that gets the diamonds must take the snakes too. Okay, the last of those books, I want to read you. There's a little boy who sings all the way through it, and this is the song of one of these little boys who could dance. It is called the BumbleGander Song. It's one of my favorite children's poems, and so I read it. It takes not very long. The song, the little boy could sing and dance, and he does it with great flair and gusto and yellow boots. And he sings, "Oh, a bumblegander fell in love with a winter flutterby. He decided he would marry her and carry her away. But she declined, and he resigned that he would surely die. And for his final meal, he chose to eat a 3-pound pie. He dined and pined and pined and dined and went to see his love. He ate a dozen loaves of bread with 20 pots of tea. The flutterby was most chagrined and circled high above. 'You have no manners, bumblegander. I loathe your gluttony. Oh, fly on by, you flutterby. You surely now can see I would as lief forget my grief by losing you above, and by drinking up 100 cups and eating berry bees. You'll rue the day you cast away the bumblegander's love.' He had resolved that he would eat himself to death, and thus the guilty flutterby would really bear the blame of having stolen evermore the bumblegander's breath. She'd cry and sigh to live a life of tears and shame. And so he ate and ate and ate. And then he ate some more. And when the camadons were gone and all the cupboards bare, he ate the roof, and then the walls, and then devoured the floor. And after he had swallowed whole the tables and the chair, he ate a forest and a chorus of singing schools of eels. He ate the trees and hives of bees and swallowed all the snakes. He ate the ground and turned around and gobbled down the fields. He ate the sky and said, 'Oh my, I am so thirsty now. I think as how I'd like to drink the lakes.' He drank a lake and then a stream, then ate all the ground. He gobbled rills and rocks and hills and all the grass around. Made fat and full by all he ate, he did admit the hour was late and he would likely die, when there at last she fluttered by, the winter flutterby. He cried and tried to get his bride to fly his way again, but he had eaten everything. She found nowhere to land. So finally, sky-weary, she lit upon his hand. All right, I'll marry you, she said. Never mind, I've grieved and pined, and now I've eaten all. Dear Flutterby, I'm hungry. I'd rather eat than wed. He popped her in his mouth and found her sweet as berry bread. And now at last, my love, we're one. We should have married soon before I ate the wedding guests. Now that I've devoured the bride, I think I'll eat the groom. And looking hungry at his leg, he soon laid aside his spoon. And standing on his narrow shelf, he nipped his leg, then ate himself. Now when BumbleGanders fly or flutterbys are kept, when BumbleGanders do propose, the flutterbys accept. I want to close by reading for you about 4 of the children's poems. This first one is these are all 4 from the book, When the Aardvark Parked on the Ark. The first one celebrates the letter B, as in the alphabet letter B, and it reads like this. If there were no B's, it sure would be sad. We'd have to ride Ikes and sleep in our Eds. And kids who play trumpets would play in the and. We'd eat our hamburgers at hamburger stands. At ice cream cafes, eating utter Scotch sundaes and anana splits. And utterly affled, we'd just sit and sit. All hares would be unnies. It sure would sound funny, and sweet little AEs would not seem so huggy. Their mothers would stroll them and lack AE Uggies. If muscles were iceps and minds were all reins, we'd all hit an ace all or play with our trains or carry umbrellas to keep off the rains. We'd have to ride usses and uckle our oots and utten our lasers down over our suits. And sweet little urds would fly as urds do, high in the sky where the skies are quite blue. Ever since I was born, I was thankful for skies and good ooks and row oats and strawberry pies and chocolate milkshakes and raspberry freezes and maples and oaks and mulberry trees. But mostly I'm thankful whenever I please to use hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bees. I suspect that all of us from time to time get a little overweight, and sometimes we are intemperate in the way we get rid of it. This poem is called Thin Minnie. I'm simply too fat, cried Minnie McBride when she found herself stuck in a slippery slide. And there, halfway down, she wailed and she cried, I must lose some weight. I've grown far too wide. I'm embarrassed to find myself wedged in this slide. I'm giving up chocolates, wept Minnie McBride, spaghetti and bonbons and everything fried. 6 firemen came, and they pushed and they pried till they popped Minnie out of that slippery slide. She then lost some weight and regained her pride, but went overboard with her calorie guide. So Minnie grew skinny, just 3 inches wide, and the first gust of wind blew her back up the slide. Temperance in all things. Huh? Well, I want to have my wife help me read this one, and this one will be incomprehensible to you unless you can remember that Raspberry Mary in this tongue twister works at a dairy, and Strawberry Sherry runs a ferry boat, and Blueberry Terry, who loves them both, works on a prairie. He is a cowboy on the prairie. Remember, Raspberry Mary is at the dairy, Strawberry Sherry is on the ferry, and Blueberry Terry is on the prairie. I think it will make sense to you then. Sweet Strawberry Sherry, will you ever marry? Asked Blueberry Terry.
But she shook her head. I find marriage scary, dear Blueberry Terry. Ask Raspberry Mary to marry instead. I'll not marry Terry, said Raspberry Mary, for Blueberry Terry resides on the prairie. I won't leave my dairy to follow him west.
Then you I can't marry, said Blueberry Terry. I won't leave my prairie to work for a dairy, dear Strawberry Sherry. Please, marry me now.
No, Terry. Like Mary, I do not like prairie. I live on a ferry and never would marry a man so content to care for his cows.
Very well, Sherry. Very well, Mary. I'll leave my prairie. Will one of you marry me now?
I don't find you handsome, said Raspberry Mary. I don't find you wealthy, said Strawberry Sherry. And since you're not handsome and do not have wealth, we think that we'll soon marry somebody else.
So Blueberry Terry returned to the prairie and rarely saw Mary and Sherry, but then Mary and Sherry at ferry and dairy never were asked if they'd marry again. At dairy and ferry they grew old and thin, and were both nearly 90 when they hobbled in.
"Dear Blueberry Terry," said Strawberry Sherry, "I've changed my mind, Terry. I'll marry you now." "Yes, Terry, dear Terry," said Raspberry Mary. "I'll marry you, Terry. I'll marry, and how?"
I don't find you pretty. I don't find you wealthy. And since you're ugly and have no real wealth, I think I'll return to my cows and my prairie. And there I may marry somebody else. I really don't know who I'll marry now. I'm living alone, surrounded by cows.
In a small cemetery, they buried old Mary and poor lonely Sherry, whose tombstones there read, "Here Strawberry Sherry and Raspberry Mary were buried, unmarried, both single and dead."
And old Blueberry Terry, their man from the prairie, felt so alone as his final years sped, he married his Guernsey far out on the prairie, delighted he finally found something to wed. Okay, that's enough reading for tonight. Let me read you one more. I had one more down. It's kind of my favorite Bible poem. I always read one Bible poem so you know I'm a preacher. And this one's called David and Goliath. Goliath says, "Fee-fi-fo-foy, I smell the blood of a little boy." "Don't mind me, Goliath, I'm just collecting rocks." "Fee-fi-fo-feek, little shepherd boys are weak." "Don't be too sure, I just found another rock." "Fee-fi-fo-foff, I'm going to knock your head clear off." "One more rock, that makes 3. Here's one more, now there's 4. Sakes alive, now there's 5. Fee-fi-fo-fot, whether you got rocks or not, I'll get you, you slingshot tot. Ready or not, here comes a rock. Fee-fi-fo-fed, what's this sticking in my head? Oops, I'm dead. Okay, that's enough. Let me ask if there are any questions or answers that you have tonight about any of this. Anyone? Okay, Jim, it's been very, very good to be with you. Thank you so much for having us over.